As a big player in the small SUV segment, it should be little surprise to see that the Kia Seltos is back for a mid-cycle facelift. And as well as some handsome new looks, there's also some hefty changes beneath its new skin.
Chasing cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
This range-topping Seltos GT-Line all-wheel drive right here starts from around $47,000 drive away in New South Wales, which isn't exactly cheap. But anyway, let's take a look at the 3 best and the 3 not so good aspects of it. First up, I want to talk about the light design on the front of the Seltos, because while it is kind of subtle from what we saw in the last generation car, this new bold line across the front, sitting in the midst of the strong new black grille, really gives it a sort of jawline, and I'm a fan of it. So in terms of design, the changes are subtle from the last generation Seltos in this facelift, but they give it a more refreshed view. So up front you've got that light design that I spoke about before that keeps it quite tidy. Then there's the 18-inch wheels that this GT line comes standard on, which don't look too different to the last generation's GT alloys that were black and silver, but again, they give it a nice look. Come around the side of the Seltos and things are largely the same, but there are integrated indicators in the wing mirrors, and there's a two-tone blacktop, which is carried over from the last one. But interestingly enough, you can't actually option a sunroof if you go for a two-tone car. Like the front of the SUV, at the rear, light design is largely the main difference, with a big red light bar running across the majority of the tailgate. And finally, I'd like to point out the fact that on every single Seltos, apart from that entry-level S model, you get these 2 large displays on the dash. And now, if we're talking about the not so good things about this new Seltos, firstly, I want to bring up the fact that you can't actually get wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto on any car that isn't the entry-level S grade. And secondly, I'd like to bring up the speed limiter assist in this new Seltos, because in the past, Kia's safety systems, they've been nice to live with, but this new speed limit assist is super intrusive, and you have to do about 3 keystrokes to turn it off each time, and then when you turn the car off and turn it back on again, the system resets, so you have to repeat. It's just hard to live with. And finally, I'd like to point out that this Seltos GT line all-wheel drive that I'm sitting in here is $16,000 more expensive than the entry-level Seltos S. On the inside, this updated Seltos, it looks as handsome as it does on the outside, but some of the surfaces feel a little low rent. There's soft touch materials on the majority of surfaces that you'll find yourself touching a lot of the time, but then again, you've got hard touches up here and piano black across here and down here, which feels a little cheap, especially when you consider that this Seltos almost costs $50,000 drive away. Artificial leather covers every seat in the cabin of the Seltos, and speaking of these front seats, they're both heated and cooled, and driver and the passenger get power adjustment. While head and legroom is plentiful in this front row, the practicality isn't actually that great. The door bins seem quite small for an SUV of this stature, and there's a couple of cup holders here, but this center console isn't overly big, and you'd probably struggle to fit a water bottle in there. In terms of the amenities in the front row, drivers get both a USB-A and a USB-C port, as well as a 12-volt socket, but best of all, there's wireless phone charging. On the dash sit a pair of 10.25-inch digital displays, one which handles infotainment, and the other which handles driver display with a digital speedometer and tachometer. And if that's not enough, you also get a heads-up display up there on the windscreen. But as I mentioned before, wireless phone connection when it comes to Apple CarPlay and Android Auto isn't a thing, so drivers are going to have to plug their phone in. And finally, I just want to appreciate the fact that Kia is obviously committed to good old-fashioned tactile buttons, because you won't find any touchpads on the multi-function steering wheel or the climate controls. Back here in the second row, the same artificial leather covers the seats, and they're pretty comfortable, and head and legroom is actually reasonably generous. And as I mentioned before, you get a pair of air vents back here, as well as a couple of USB-C ports. Like the front, there's actually not a heap of practicality. The door bins aren't massive. You do get a strange phone holdery thing down the bottom there, and then, as you'd expect, a pair of cup holders come down in the armrest. Back here at the boot, the range-topping GT line has a power tailgate as standard, and when that opens, the amenities, they're few and far between. But in terms of space, there's 433 litres with the rear seats in place, and this jumps to 1,393 when those seats are folded down. And it's also worth noting that the Seltos comes with a full-size matching alloy spare, which is quite a rarity in the small SUV segment. When it comes to the cost of keeping the Seltos on the road, Kia claims a combined fuel economy of 7.4 litres per 100 kilometres. During testing, the best that we could imagine was 8 litres per 100 kilometres, which isn't exactly at Kia's claim, but then again, the drive route through the Blue Mountains on the launch is probably to blame for that higher figure. When it comes to servicing the Seltos, Kia Australia offers a 7-year, 70,000 kilometre plan that costs $3,214. But if you just want 5 years or 50,000 kilometres of cap price servicing, it's going to cost $1,989. And then on the warranty front, the Seltos is covered under Kia's 7-year unlimited kilometre warranty. Over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer paid $873 to comprehensively insure their new Kia Seltos. Your premium may vary based on things that insurers take into account, such as your age, driving history, where you live, and whether or not you garage the car. In Australia, buyers have two options of powertrain when it comes to the Seltos. There's the entry-level 2-litre turbo, which is mated with a CVT that sends power exclusively to the front wheels, and then there's the 1.6-litre turbo, which is carried over from the last generation Seltos. But instead of a dual clutch, it's now mated with a traditional 8-speed torque converter automatic transmission. 146 kilowatts and 265 newton meters is what this turbocharged mill pumps out, which represents a 36 kilowatt jump in power from that naturally aspirated engine. An all-wheel drive system comes standard with a 1.6 litre turbocharged engine, and in terms of performance, Kia claims a 0 to 100 figure of 8.4 seconds, but in independent testing, we found that it'll actually do it in just 8.3 seconds. And while that might not be anywhere near hot hatch territory on paper, in reality, it feels fast. It feels like this engine has adequate power to push the SUV along. And then when it comes to the transmission, it might sound like a step backwards to replace a dual clutch transmission in a GT-Line car with a regular 8-speed automatic, but truth be told, this system, it's actually really smooth, and if you're really pushing it, the shifts are snappy. And then if we step away from performance, because I mean, a family-friendly small SUV probably isn't about performance, this transmission is actually nicer to use because you don't get that same kind of awkward, clunky nature of a dual clutch at low speeds. It's just a nice torque converter to use. Traction in this range-topping GT line isn't really an issue because it has all-wheel drive as standard, and then also because the power and torque level that the engine produces isn't enough to get the wheels spinning. So in here you've got the option of 3 driving modes, and they include Eco, Normal and Sport. But without adaptive dampers or any sort of sporty exhaust systems, it's kind of hard to tell what these drive modes actually do. As you'd expect, Eco mode maximizes fuel economy by lessening throttle response and making the car a little bit more sluggish, but obviously it conserves fuel in the long run. Normal, I mean, it does what it says on the tin, it's normal. In Sport, I'd say one of the main draw cards is it changes the digital driver display to like fire and etc. It's all red and fun. I like that. The throttle response feels a little bit faster and the transmission will shift at a more impressive rate. The steering is also another thing that seems to change when you switch into sport mode, as it gets a bit firmer. But if I'm honest, I don't think it really needs it because the steering feel in this car is quite impressive as standard, and even through Eco and Normal modes, it's got a nice level of firmness to it. But in saying that, there's minimal road feel translated back to the driver through the steering wheel, and when traction does go a little haywire, you're not going to be able to tell. Honestly, I'm actually really impressed with how this Seltos rides. I mean, it's not soft, but it isn't hard either, and the ride, it's really comfortable. Over rough roads, it can get a little fidgety, but still, I wouldn't call it brittle, and it's not to the point of being uncomfortable. On the safety front, Kia has actually dropped those safety packs that were optional in the last generation of Seltos, and the full active suite is now standard across the range. But you're going to have to opt for the range-topping GT line, like the one I'm sitting in here, if you want to make the most of the full active adaptive cruise control system. As a whole, Kia's new Seltos is an impressive package that will be a strong contender in the ever-growing small SUV segment. From its handsome new looks to its impressive driving dynamics, it's hard to fault. But then again, the lack of wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto will be a deal breaker for some, and the only way to avoid this problem is to opt for the entry-level S variant, which misses out on a lot of niceties, including those dual 10.25-inch monitors that most of the range gets. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below, and while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.